Welcome to tonight's quiet journey into the forest after dark, where something is moving through the trees that most of us will never actually see happen. Somewhere above the leaf litter, an owl drops from a branch in complete silence, wings barely stirring the cold night air, and lands on a mouse that never heard it coming. No flap. No rustle. No warning at all. This is not luck. It is the result of millions of years spent perfecting a single, narrow skill, hunting in darkness so complete that most animals would be entirely helpless in it. Tonight we are going to slowly work through how an owl manages this, piece by piece. The eyes built to gather every last scrap of available light. The ears tuned to hear a heartbeat under snow. The feathers shaped specifically to erase the sound of flight itself. And the strange, flexible neck that lets an owl turn its head almost all the way around without ever moving its body at all. Along the way, we will also meet some of the different owl species living out this same nightly routine in wildly different corners of the world, from snowy northern tundra to dense tropical forest, each one shaped by its own particular stretch of habitat and history. Picture the forest floor right now, dark and still, moonlight filtering weakly through bare branches overhead. Somewhere close by, a small rodent shifts under a pile of dead leaves, certain it cannot be heard or seen. It is wrong on both counts, and by the time it realizes that, it will already be too late. We will begin with the eyes, since that is where most people assume this entire story starts, and where the truth turns out to be a little more surprising than expected, involving both remarkable ability and a genuine, hard limit most people never hear about. An owl's eyes are enormous compared to the rest of its skull, so large in some species that there is barely any room left for the muscles that would normally let an eye rotate freely in its socket. This is part of why an owl cannot simply glance sideways the way a person or a cat can. The eyes are essentially fixed in place, tube-shaped rather than round, built for maximum light capture rather than easy movement. Inside those eyes sits an extraordinarily high number of rod cells, the type of light-sensitive cell responsible for vision in dim conditions. Rods vastly outnumber the color-detecting cone cells found in an owl's retina, which is why owl vision in daylight is actually fairly limited in terms of color and fine detail, a trade-off made entirely in favor of seeing in the dark. The size of the pupil matters enormously too. An owl's pupil can open extremely wide, letting in a much larger amount of whatever faint light happens to be available, whether from stars, moonlight, or simply the residual glow bouncing softly off snow or water nearby. Even a mostly overcast, moonless night still carries a surprising amount of usable light scattered across the sky, and an owl's eyes are built specifically to catch every last trace of it. Behind the retina of many owl species sits an additional reflective layer, similar in principle to the one found in cats, which bounces light back through the light-sensitive cells a second time, giving the eye a second chance to register anything it might have missed on the first pass. This layer is part of why an owl's eyes sometimes appear to glow faintly when caught directly in a beam of light at night. None of this, though, means an owl can see in absolute total darkness, and that distinction turns out to matter quite a bit, more than most people realize when they first hear owls described as creatures that can see in the dark. Here is something that tends to surprise people. An owl cannot actually see anything at all in complete, total darkness, the kind found deep inside a sealed cave with no light source whatsoever. No eye on the planet, no matter how well adapted, can generate an image from 0 photons of light. Vision, at its most basic level, requires something to actually see by. What owls are extraordinarily good at is working with vanishingly small amounts of light, quantities so faint that most other animals, humans included, would perceive as nothing more than pure blackness. A forest at night rarely counts as truly dark in this stricter sense. Starlight, distant moonlight, faint reflected glow off clouds or snow, all of it adds up to just enough scattered light for an owl's finely tuned eyes to work with. Even inside dense woodland, where the canopy blocks a great deal of the sky above, enough light usually filters down through gaps in the branches, or reflects faintly off pale bark and frost, to give an owl's eyes at least something to gather. True absolute darkness is genuinely rare almost anywhere outdoors on Earth. Researchers studying owl vision have found their eyes can detect light levels roughly 100 times fainter than what a human eye can register, an enormous gap that explains a huge amount of what makes owls such capable nighttime hunters. Even so, on truly overcast, moonless nights deep in dense forest, even an owl's exceptional eyes eventually reach their limit. At that point, an owl does not simply stop hunting. It shifts its reliance instead, leaning far more heavily on sound and sight, adjusting its whole approach to prey almost seamlessly depending on exactly how much usable light happens to be available on any given night. This is exactly where a second, entirely different sense takes over almost completely, and it may be even more remarkable than the eyes themselves. An owl's hearing is built with a precision that puts most other animals to shame, and in the darkest, most light-starved conditions, it becomes the dominant sense guiding an entire hunt. Many owl species have ears positioned slightly asymmetrically on either side of the head, one set marginally higher than the other, a small structural quirk that turns out to matter enormously. This asymmetry lets an owl pinpoint the exact vertical and horizontal position of a sound with remarkable accuracy, since a sound reaching the higher ear fractions of a second before the lower one gives the owl's brain enough information to triangulate a precise location, even through snow, leaves, or thick undergrowth. Some species, like the barn owl, have been studied extensively for this exact ability, demonstrated in laboratory conditions to strike prey accurately in complete darkness, guided by sound alone. The flat, disc-shaped face many owls have plays its own quiet role here too, functioning almost like a satellite dish, channeling sound waves toward the ears with far greater efficiency than a flatter face ever could. Some species can even adjust the shape of this facial disc slightly, fine-tuning how sound gets funneled in, depending on the exact direction they are focusing on at any given moment. Between the eyes and the ears working together, an owl builds an extraordinarily detailed picture of its surroundings, even when there is barely any light or clear view to work with at all. This combination effectively means an owl is never truly relying on just one sense at a time. Sight and sound layer together continuously, each one filling in gaps the other cannot cover, creating a single, unified sense of the surrounding world far more complete than either input could ever manage entirely on its own. Let us pause here for a moment and simply rest in the stillness of the forest. A narrow beam of moonlight falling across a patch of frost-covered grass. Somewhere overhead, bare branches sway just slightly in a light current of cold air, and then settle again into quiet. Nothing moves for a long stretch of time, the whole scene suspended in that particular kind of silence only a winter forest at night seems to hold. This calm surface, though, hides a great deal of quiet activity happening just beneath it. Small creatures moving carefully through leaf litter, believing themselves hidden. An owl perched somewhere unseen, patiently gathering sound and faint light, piecing together a picture no human eye or ear could ever fully reconstruct. A fox somewhere in the distance pauses mid-step, ears swiveling briefly toward a sound too faint for anything but a trained nocturnal ear to register. The whole forest, in its own quiet way, is listening tonight, each creature tuned to whatever particular slice of the darkness its own senses were built to catch. Snow begins settling lightly across the branches above, muffling what little sound remains, deepening the hush even further. Somewhere within all of this stillness, patience is quietly doing exactly what it was built to do, a slow, coiled readiness waiting for the right moment to finally act. We will continue shortly, moving next into perhaps the most famous piece of this entire story, the extraordinary silence of an owl's flight itself. Owl flight remains almost eerily silent compared to nearly every other bird of similar size, and for a very long time researchers were not entirely sure exactly why. The answer eventually turned out to be tucked into the structure of the feathers themselves, specifically the leading edge of the wing. Most birds have a smooth, hard edge along the front of their flight feathers, which works well for generating lift efficiently but creates a fair amount of turbulent air as it cuts through space, producing the familiar whooshing sound most flying birds make. Owls instead have a soft, comb-like fringe of tiny serrations along this same leading edge, which breaks up that turbulence into much smaller, quieter currents of air before it ever reaches the trailing part of the wing. A second feather adaptation adds even more to this silence. The trailing edge of an owl's wing carries a soft, frayed fringe as well, further smoothing out airflow as it leaves the wing. On top of all this, the entire surface of an owl's flight feathers is covered in an unusually soft, velvety texture, absorbing what little remaining sound might otherwise be produced as feather brushes gently against feather during each wing beat. The combined effect is a bird that can approach prey almost completely undetected by sound, a silence so complete that researchers using specialized microphones have struggled to pick up any meaningful noise at all from a hunting owl passing just a few feet away. Compare this to a pigeon or a duck taking off nearby, where the wing beats alone can be heard clearly from a considerable distance, and the contrast becomes almost startling. An owl the size of a large hawk can drift silently past someone standing just a few steps away, close enough to feel the faint stir of air, without a single sound reaching their ears at all. This silent flight comes with a genuine trade-off, one worth mentioning here since it shapes a lot about how owls actually hunt. The same soft, fringed feather structure that eliminates sound also reduces overall flight efficiency somewhat, meaning owls generally cannot fly as fast, as far, or for as long as many other birds of similar size. This is part of why most owl species rely heavily on a sit-and-wait hunting strategy rather than long, sustained pursuit. An owl typically perches quietly, listening and watching for long stretches, then commits to a short, precise, nearly silent final approach once prey has been located with real confidence, rather than chasing something across open distance the way a hawk or falcon might. It is a clear example of evolution favoring one advantage heavily at the expense of another, trading raw speed and stamina almost entirely for stealth, since for a nighttime hunter relying so heavily on catching prey completely by surprise, silence turns out to matter far more than sheer velocity ever could. This trade-off also shapes where different owl species tend to hunt. Species relying most heavily on this sit-and-wait approach are often found in denser forest, where short, precise, silent strikes work better than open pursuit, while a few owl species living in more open grassland have adapted slightly faster, more active hunting styles instead. A small reminder that even within this one family of birds, the balance between silence and speed still shifts depending on habitat. Next, we turn to something almost as famous as the silent flight itself, that strange, seemingly impossible head rotation owls are so well known for. An owl cannot move its eyes much within their sockets, which means the entire head has to do the work instead whenever an owl needs to look in a different direction. To compensate for this, owls have developed an extraordinary range of neck rotation, some species capable of turning their heads roughly 270 degrees in either direction from center. This works thanks to a remarkable set of adaptations tucked inside the neck itself. Owls have considerably more neck vertebrae than humans do, and the blood vessels running through that neck are built with small reservoirs that allow blood to pool safely during extreme rotation, preventing the kind of dangerous restriction that would otherwise cut off circulation to the brain in a neck twisted that far around. Researchers using imaging studies have found that an owl's main arteries also have built-in backup connections, allowing blood to reroute smoothly around whichever vessels happen to be pinched during a sharp turn, keeping a steady, uninterrupted supply flowing to the brain and eyes throughout the entire motion. This dramatic head rotation, paired with those fixed, forward-facing eyes, gives an owl something close to a complete field of view around its entire body, all without ever needing to move its shoulders or torso at all, a strange but remarkably elegant solution to the limitation those enormous, immobile eyes create in the first place. It also means an owl can remain almost perfectly still while continuously scanning its surroundings, head slowly rotating one direction and then the other, body never shifting an inch, a stillness that makes an already well-camouflaged bird even harder to spot against the bark of a tree at night. Taken together, everything covered so far starts to build into a fairly complete picture of just how specialized an owl's nighttime hunting toolkit actually is. Eyes built to gather almost every available scrap of light, understanding clearly where that ability actually ends. Hearing precise enough to locate prey through solid snow or thick fallen leaves. Feathers engineered specifically to erase the sound of flight, even at the cost of raw speed. And a neck built to compensate almost completely for eyes that cannot move on their own. None of these traits developed in isolation from one another. Each one seems to have shaped, and been shaped by, all the others, evolving together over an enormous stretch of time into one single, tightly integrated hunting system built almost entirely around exploiting darkness rather than working around it. It is easy to look at a resting owl during the day, feathers fluffed, eyes half closed, and assume very little is happening. As we now understand fairly clearly, once darkness falls, that same still, quiet bird becomes one of the most precisely tuned predators found anywhere in the natural world. There is a certain quiet irony in that contrast, an animal so often associated with wisdom and stillness in daylight, transforming after dark into something built almost entirely around speed, precision, and a hunt most of its prey will never see coming. It is worth remembering, too, that none of these individual traits would count for much on their own. A silent wing without accurate hearing would simply be a quiet bird flying blind. Sharp hearing without a flexible neck to aim it precisely would waste half its usefulness. Only together, layered carefully over an enormous stretch of evolutionary time, do these pieces add up to something genuinely formidable? As we settle into a brief pause here, picture the forest one more time, fully dark now, a thin scattering of stars visible through gaps in the bare canopy overhead. Somewhere on a low branch, an owl sits motionless, head tilted slightly, listening to something moving far below in the leaf litter that no human ear could ever hope to detect from this distance. This story has covered a fair amount of ground already: the light-gathering limits of an owl's eyes, the precision of its hearing, the quiet engineering behind its silent flight, and the strange, flexible neck that lets it see in nearly every direction without moving its body at all. Bit by bit, a picture has come together of an animal built, almost from the ground up, around one single, narrow purpose: hunting successfully in darkness most other creatures simply could not survive in. None of this happened quickly, in evolutionary terms. Each of these traits developed gradually, refined across countless generations, until the finished result became something close to a perfectly balanced nighttime hunting machine, wrapped in soft feathers and a famously calm, watchful face. There is still more of this story left to explore: different owl species scattered across very different parts of the world, their varied hunting grounds and family lives, and a few old myths about owls worth gently sorting from the facts we now actually understand. For now, the forest stays quiet, the owl stays still, and somewhere below, something small continues moving through the leaves, entirely unaware of just how little its hiding place is actually helping, and how little time it likely has left before that silence above finally breaks. Owls are found on every continent except Antarctica, and that spread has produced an enormous range of shapes, sizes, and hunting styles across roughly 250 known species. The snowy owl, built for the open, treeless tundra of the Arctic, looks almost nothing like the tiny elf owl found in the deserts of the American Southwest, barely larger than a sparrow and small enough to nest inside a hollowed-out cactus. Despite these huge differences in size and appearance, the core toolkit stays remarkably consistent across nearly every species: the light-gathering eyes, the precise hearing, the silent flight feathers. What changes is how each species applies that toolkit to its own particular corner of the world. A snowy owl hunting across open, snow-covered tundra relies far more heavily on eyesight than owls living in dense forest, since prey out in the open tends to be more visible from a distance, even in dim Arctic twilight. Forest-dwelling species, by contrast, often lean more heavily on hearing, since thick vegetation blocks a clear line of sight even during the brightest moonlit nights. This single family of birds has essentially been reshaped, again and again, to fit whatever environment it happens to occupy, while keeping the same fundamental nighttime hunting system running underneath all of it. Some species have even adapted to daytime activity, breaking from the strictly nocturnal pattern most people associate with owls entirely. The snowy owl, living through Arctic summers with nearly constant daylight, has little choice but to hunt whenever prey happens to be active, regardless of whether the sun has actually set. The burrowing owl offers another striking departure, nesting underground in burrows often dug by prairie dogs or ground squirrels, spending much of its time on open grassland rather than perched high in trees the way most people picture an owl behaving. The barn owl deserves special mention here, since it remains one of the most studied and most widely distributed owl species on the planet, found on nearly every continent aside from Antarctica in one form or another. Its heart-shaped facial disc is considered one of the most efficient sound-collecting structures found in any bird, funneling even the faintest rustle directly toward those precisely offset ears. Laboratory studies on barn owls have demonstrated hunting accuracy in complete darkness that borders on astonishing, with test subjects striking a moving target within a small margin of error using sound alone, no visual information involved at all. This has made the barn owl something of a natural model species for researchers studying sound localization more broadly, since its abilities offer such a clean, extreme example of just how far this particular sense can be pushed. Barn owls also tend to favor open farmland and grassland over dense forest, hunting mostly rodents moving through low grass, a habitat choice that has actually brought them into close, often beneficial contact with human agriculture, since a single barn owl family can consume a genuinely significant number of crop-damaging rodents across just one breeding season. Some farmers have taken to installing nest boxes specifically to encourage barn owls to settle nearby, treating them almost as a natural, chemical-free form of pest control, a practical partnership that has grown more common as awareness of the species' hunting efficiency has spread among agricultural communities in recent decades. This relationship benefits both sides considerably. Farms gain a highly effective, entirely free rodent control system, while barn owls gain access to reliable, abundant hunting grounds, a rare case of human agriculture and a wild predator settling into something genuinely close to mutual benefit. Great horned owls, found widely across the Americas, represent a very different approach within this same broader family, considerably larger and more powerful than the barn owl, with a hunting range that stretches to include prey as large as skunks, rabbits, and even other birds of prey. Their name comes from the prominent feather tufts on top of the head, often mistaken for actual ears, though they serve no hearing function at all and exist purely as a visual, communicative feature. This species has adapted to an unusually wide range of habitats, from dense forest to open desert to the edges of major cities, making it one of the most widespread and successful owl species found across the entire Western Hemisphere. Great horned owls are also known for an unusually strong grip, capable of exerting pressure far beyond what would be needed simply to hold on to a typical meal, likely an adaptation suited to subduing considerably larger, more resistant prey than most other owl species regularly attempt to tackle. Their calls, the deep, rhythmic hooting most people picture when they imagine an owl at all, carry remarkably far through open landscape, often used to establish territory well before any actual hunting begins each evening. Great horned owls also show a genuine willingness to take on prey most other owl species would avoid entirely, including porcupines despite the obvious risk, and even other, smaller owl species, making them one of the more formidable and adaptable predators found anywhere in this entire family of birds. This adaptability, more than raw size alone, likely explains why the species has managed to thrive across such an enormous geographic range, from dense Canadian forest all the way down through Central and South America, adjusting its diet and hunting approach to whatever local conditions happen to offer. At the opposite end of the size spectrum sits the elf owl, one of the smallest owl species in the world, weighing barely more than a few ounces fully grown. Found primarily across the deserts of the southwestern United States and northern Mexico, this tiny predator has adapted to an environment that looks almost nothing like the dense forest most people associate with typical owl habitat. Elf owls frequently nest inside cavities carved out by woodpeckers in large saguaro cacti, repurposing abandoned nesting holes rather than excavating their own. This particular desert environment brings its own unique challenges: extreme daytime heat, scarce water, and a very different range of available prey, mostly insects and small invertebrates rather than the rodents larger owl species typically favor. Despite its tiny size, the elf owl still carries the same core toolkit found across the entire owl family: silent flight, sharp low-light vision, and precise hearing, simply scaled down to match a body barely larger than many songbirds. It stands as a clear reminder that this whole nighttime hunting system scales remarkably well, working just as effectively for a bird the size of a fist as it does for one the size of a large house cat. Elf owls also tend to be considerably more social than many other owl species, sometimes nesting in loose proximity to one another within the same stand of cacti, a small departure from the more solitary, territorial behavior typically seen in larger owl species elsewhere. Their diet leans heavily on scorpions, moths, and beetles, all abundant across the desert floor after dark, and their small size actually works in their favor here, letting them maneuver easily through tight spaces between cactus spines that would pose a serious problem for a considerably larger owl attempting the same hunt. Let us pause here for a short while and simply rest in stillness once more. A wide, open desert landscape stretching out beneath a clear night sky thick with stars, the air finally cooling after a long, punishing day of heat. Somewhere among tall, silent saguaro cacti, a small shape shifts almost imperceptibly near a dark cavity carved into the trunk. This particular corner of the world could not look more different from the snowy tundra or the dense forest mentioned earlier, and yet the same quiet, patient rhythm still plays out here after dark, adapted to an entirely different set of conditions, but built from the very same underlying instincts, proof that this hunting system was never tied to any single climate at all. A light desert wind moves through the spines of a nearby cactus, carrying with it the faint, dry smell of sand cooling under a clear sky. Nothing moves for a long while, the whole landscape settling into that particular hushed desert seemed to hold once the heat of the day finally lets go. Far overhead, a shooting star briefly crosses the sky, gone before it could ever mean anything to whatever creatures happen to be watching from below. The desert continues on exactly as it has for longer than anyone could easily measure, the same quiet cycle of heat and cold repeating itself night after night, largely indifferent to whoever happens to be watching. We will continue shortly, moving next into how owl families actually raise their young, a process that looks quite different depending on which species and which corner of the world we happen to be looking at. Owl family life varies considerably across species, though most share a few broad similarities worth exploring here. Unlike many birds that build elaborate nests from scratch, most owl species instead rely heavily on existing structures, abandoned nests built by other birds, natural tree cavities, or in some cases, simply a scraped-out hollow directly on open ground. Female owls typically take on the majority of incubation duties, staying close to the nest for extended stretches while the male handles most of the hunting, delivering food regularly throughout this period. This division of labor allows the female to remain warm and protective over the eggs almost continuously, a particularly important adaptation for species nesting in especially cold climates, like the snowy owl breeding across open Arctic tundra. Owl chicks, sometimes called owlets, hatch at noticeably different times within the same clutch, since incubation typically begins as soon as the first egg is laid rather than waiting for the full clutch to be complete. This staggered hatching creates a natural size difference among siblings, which in years with scarce food can result in older, larger chicks outcompeting their younger siblings for available meals, a harsh but effective strategy for ensuring at least some offspring survive during particularly difficult breeding seasons. Clutch size itself varies quite a bit depending on how much food happens to be available in a given year, with some species laying noticeably more eggs during years when prey populations are unusually abundant, an adjustment that allows owl populations to expand quickly when conditions are favorable, then contract again once resources tighten, keeping the wider population roughly balanced against whatever the environment can actually support. Survival for young owls remains genuinely difficult even after successfully fledging the nest, with mortality rates considerably higher during that crucial first year of independent life compared to any later stage. Learning to hunt effectively, particularly mastering the precise combination of silent flight and accurate sound localization discussed earlier, takes real practice, and young owls often struggle noticeably during their earliest solo hunting attempts. Parent owls in many species continue supporting their young for some time after fledging, occasionally still delivering food even as the young bird begins attempting its own hunts nearby, a gradual transition rather than an abrupt cutoff from parental support. This extended learning period gives young owls valuable time to refine the coordination between hearing, sight, and flight that adult hunting success depends on so heavily. Territory establishment adds another layer of difficulty once a young owl does become fully independent, since suitable hunting grounds are often already claimed by established adults, sometimes forcing young owls to travel considerable distances before finally settling into their own viable territory, a genuinely risky period that accounts for a significant portion of overall mortality within this first independent year of life. Those young owls that do successfully establish territory and survive their first full year, though, tend to go on to live surprisingly long lives for a bird of their size, some species regularly reaching 10 years or more in the wild, a considerable payoff for surviving such a genuinely difficult early stretch of independent life. Across countless human cultures throughout history, owls have occupied a strange, often contradictory symbolic space, sometimes revered as wise, sometimes feared as omens of death or misfortune. In ancient Greece, the owl was closely associated with Athena, goddess of wisdom, an association that has carried forward into much of modern Western culture, where owls still commonly symbolize intelligence and careful thought. In several other cultural traditions, though, owls carried a considerably darker reputation. Various folk traditions across parts of Africa, the Middle East, and indigenous communities in North America associated owl calls with impending death or bad fortune, likely influenced by the genuinely eerie, unfamiliar sound of owl calls carried across quiet night air, paired with the bird's habit of appearing suddenly and silently, seemingly out of nowhere. Much of this fear likely traces back to simple unfamiliarity. A creature capable of flying in complete silence, appearing and vanishing without warning, understandably unsettled people across many different eras and cultures long before modern science could offer a clear biological explanation for exactly how and why that silence was even possible in the first place. Even within a single region, beliefs about owls could vary considerably from one community to the next, some viewing the same call as a warning to be heeded, others viewing it as nothing more than an ordinary part of the nighttime landscape, worth noting but hardly cause for concern. In parts of East Asia, owls carried yet another distinct set of associations, sometimes linked to ingratitude or bad luck in certain traditional stories, while in other regional traditions they were viewed with a kind of cautious respect, powerful creatures best left undisturbed rather than actively feared outright. Modern science has gradually replaced a lot of this older folklore with a clearer, evidence-based picture, though a surprising number of the old observations turn out to hold up reasonably well once properly understood. The unsettling silence attributed to omens and spirits, for instance, has a very concrete explanation now, tied directly to those specialized feather adaptations covered earlier in this story. Some remaining folklore, though, has been more directly corrected. Widespread beliefs that owls are inherently wise, for example, do not hold up particularly well under closer scientific scrutiny, since actual studies of owl problem-solving and cognitive ability generally place them below many other bird species, crows and parrots in particular, when tested on genuinely complex cognitive tasks. This does not diminish what owls actually are especially good at, which is an extraordinarily refined, specialized set of sensory and physical adaptations built almost entirely around nighttime hunting rather than the kind of broader, flexible problem-solving intelligence associated with species like crows. Owls are not unusually wise. They are unusually, remarkably well built for one very specific, narrow purpose. It is a small but meaningful correction worth sitting with, since it reframes an old symbol not as inaccurate exactly, but simply pointed at the wrong kind of intelligence entirely, mistaking specialized physical mastery for the broader cleverness people originally assumed it represented. Crows, by comparison, have been documented using tools, recognizing individual human faces years later, and solving multi-step puzzles for a reward, genuine markers of flexible problem-solving that owl cognition studies simply have not matched, no matter how impressive their sensory specialization happens to be. Pulling together everything covered across this section, a much broader picture of the owl world starts to take shape. Roughly 250 species spread across nearly every continent, each one adapting that same core toolkit of silent flight, sharp hearing, and low-light vision to its own particular habitat, from Arctic tundra to desert cactus to dense temperate forest. Family life built around borrowed nests, staggered hatching, and a genuinely difficult first year of independence for young owls learning to hunt on their own. Layered on top of all this biology sits an equally rich history of human folklore, wisdom and dread tangled together across different cultures, much of it eventually explained, and in some cases gently corrected, by the same careful science that uncovered everything else in this story so far. From the icy stillness of Arctic tundra to the dry, star-filled quiet of desert cactus stands, this same underlying pattern keeps repeating itself, an ordinary bird reshaped, again and again, into something extraordinarily well suited to the particular darkness it happens to call home. There remains a little more to explore here, particularly a closer look at a few especially unusual owl species and hunting strategies found in far corners of the world, along with some final reflection on the sheer span of evolutionary time it took to build a creature this precisely suited to hunting in darkness, one quiet wing beat at a time, across a stretch of history longer than most of us could ever comfortably picture, let alone fully imagine. Owls trace their lineage back an extraordinarily long way, with fossil evidence suggesting recognizable owl-like birds were already present tens of millions of years ago, long before most of the mammals we know today had even appeared. Some of the earliest fossil owls, found in rock layers dating back roughly 60 million years, already show early hints of the specialized skeletal features that would eventually develop into the fully formed nocturnal hunting toolkit modern owls carry today. This places the origins of owl evolution not long after the extinction event that wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs, suggesting owls were among the early bird lineages that took advantage of the ecological space left behind once so many other predators had disappeared. Nighttime hunting, largely unexploited by competing predators at the time, may have offered an early evolutionary advantage that owls' ancestors were particularly well positioned to seize. Over the tens of millions of years that followed, the specific traits explored throughout this story, the light-gathering eyes, the precise hearing, the silent feathers, the flexible neck, did not appear all at once. They developed gradually, layered on top of each other across an enormous stretch of time, each incremental improvement offering just enough advantage to be passed down and refined further by the generations that followed. Climate shifts across those millions of years likely played their own quiet role too, expanding forests here, opening grassland there, each change reshaping available prey and habitat, and nudging different owl lineages gradually toward the specific hunting strategies best suited to whatever environment they happen to find themselves settling into. Comparing owls to their closest living relatives offers an interesting window into how gradually this specialization actually unfolded. Nightjars, a separate but related group of birds, share some surface similarities with owls: nocturnal habits, cryptic coloring, large eyes suited to low light, yet lack the extreme silent flight adaptations and precise directional hearing owls eventually developed. This suggests that the full owl toolkit represents a particularly extreme, specialized branch of a broader trend toward nocturnal life found scattered elsewhere across the bird family tree. Evolution did not necessarily set out with owls as an inevitable destination. Rather, small advantages compounded gradually within one particular lineage, eventually producing a set of adaptations considerably more extreme and interconnected than what similar nocturnal pressures produced elsewhere. Genetic studies in recent decades have helped clarify these relationships further, using DNA comparisons to map out roughly how and when different owl species branched apart from one another, adding considerably more precision to a family tree that, for a long time, could only really be pieced together from fossils and physical comparison alone. These genetic studies have also occasionally revealed surprises, certain species long assumed to be closely related turning out to be more distant cousins than expected, while others separated by enormous geographic distance have proven surprisingly close on the family tree, evidence of ancient migrations and range shifts still leaving faint traces inside modern owl DNA today. The fossil record for owls remains frustratingly incomplete in certain stretches, since small, delicate bird bones do not preserve nearly as well as the larger, sturdier skeletons of many other prehistoric animals. Even so, paleontologists have managed to piece together a reasonably clear picture of how owl body size, wing structure, and skull shape shifted gradually across tens of millions of years, using the fragments that have survived. One particularly interesting fossil discovery involved an extinct owl species considerably larger than any living today, likely adapted to hunt correspondingly larger prey in an ecosystem that has long since disappeared. Finds like this help remind researchers that the owls alive today represent only a narrow slice of a much wider, more varied family that has existed and changed considerably across an enormous span of geological time. Modern genetic and fossil research together continue refining this picture even now, occasionally reshuffling assumed relationships between species as new evidence comes to light, a reminder that even a story stretching back 60 million years is still, in some corners, actively being written and rewritten by ongoing scientific discovery. Museum collections gathered over the past century have proven surprisingly valuable here too, since specimens collected decades ago, long before modern genetic testing existed, can now be revisited using entirely new techniques, occasionally yielding fresh insight from bones and feathers that have simply been sitting quietly in storage drawers, waiting for the right tools to finally come along. Stepping back across this entire evolutionary timeline, a clear pattern starts to emerge. Every single trait covered throughout this story, the eyes, the ears, the feathers, the neck, developed not in isolation, but as part of one continuously reinforcing system, each improvement making the next one more valuable, each generation building carefully on whatever advantage the last one had managed to secure. This kind of gradual, compounding refinement is fairly common across evolutionary history broadly, but rarely does it produce a final result quite this tightly integrated, quite this specifically tuned toward one single, narrow purpose. An owl today represents something close to 60 million years of continuous, patient refinement, all quietly aimed at solving one specific problem, hunting successfully in darkness that would leave almost any other predator completely helpless. It is a genuinely remarkable thing to consider, that a bird settling quietly onto a fence post on an ordinary winter night is carrying, inside its body, the accumulated result of an almost unimaginable stretch of evolutionary history, refined patiently, generation after generation, long before humans existed to ever notice or appreciate any of it. Every small trait explored throughout this story exists today only because it once offered some real, measurable advantage, however slight, over the countless generations that came before. Nothing here was designed in advance or planned towards some final goal. It simply accumulated, one useful adjustment at a time, across a length of time that stretches far beyond what any single human life could ever meaningfully compare against. Let us rest here for a short while, drifting back into stillness one more time. A quiet forest edge at the darkest point of night, stars scattered thinly across a clear, cold sky. Somewhere on a low branch nearby, an owl sits motionless, head slightly tilted, listening to something small and hidden moving carefully through the leaves far below. Nothing about this moment feels rushed or urgent. The owl is simply doing what evolution built it, across an enormous stretch of time, to do exceptionally well, waiting patiently, gathering every scrap of available information from light and sound alike, before committing to anything at all. Somewhere further off, a light breeze moves gently through bare branches, and then fades away again into silence. The whole forest seems to hold its breath together in that particular kind of hush only the deepest hours of night ever really bring. A thin layer of ground frost catches what little starlight reaches down through the canopy, scattering it faintly across the forest floor. Nothing moves for a long stretch of time, the entire scene settled into that rare, complete stillness found only well past midnight, when even the wind itself seems to have quietly paused. There is something worth sitting with quietly here, near the end of this story. Most of what has been described tonight, the exact mechanics of an owl's vision, the timing differences its brain calculates between one ear and the other, the specific feather structures eliminating sound, unfolds almost entirely outside human perception. We simply do not experience the world this way. We cannot see by starlight the way an owl can, nor hear a heartbeat buried beneath snow. And yet, on any given night, all across the world, this entire hidden system is quietly running exactly as it always has, largely unnoticed by nearly everyone. Somewhere right now, an owl is dropping silently from a branch, guided by senses far beyond ordinary human experience, completing a hunt that took shape over millions of years of patient evolutionary refinement. It is a strange, quietly humbling thought, that an entire complex, precisely tuned world exists alongside our own, active specifically during the hours most of us are already asleep, almost never crossing paths with human awareness at all, except in the rare, fortunate moment someone happens to be standing quietly outside at exactly the right time. There is no need for us to fully understand or even directly witness any of this for it to keep unfolding exactly as it has for millions of years. It continues regardless, entirely independent of whether anyone is paying attention, a quiet reminder that a great deal of what makes the natural world remarkable happens well beyond the edges of ordinary human notice. Owls remind us, in their own quiet way, that darkness is rarely as empty or as simple as it first appears. What looks, to human eyes, like nothing more than a featureless black forest at midnight is, to an owl, a richly detailed landscape full of faint light, precise sound, and careful, gathered information, more than enough to hunt successfully within. This distinction between what we perceive and what actually exists around us feels worth carrying forward beyond just this one story about owls specifically. The natural world is full of these hidden layers, senses, and abilities other creatures rely on constantly that remain almost entirely invisible to us, simply because our own particular set of senses was shaped by an entirely different set of evolutionary pressures. An owl does not experience the night as empty or frightening. It experiences it as simply another environment to work within, shaped carefully, over an enormous span of time, into exactly the kind of creature capable of thriving there. There is something quietly reassuring in that idea too, that what feels unsettling or unknowable to us is, for another creature entirely, just an ordinary Tuesday night, comfortable, familiar, and entirely within its own comfortable range of experience. As this story slowly winds toward its close, it feels worth returning one final time to that opening image, an owl dropping silently from a branch onto prey that never heard it coming. Everything covered since then, the eyes, the ears, the feathers, the flexible neck, the different species scattered across the world, the folklore layered over centuries of misunderstanding, and finally, the almost impossibly long evolutionary history behind all of it, has been building steadily toward a fuller appreciation of that single, quiet moment. What looks, at first glance, like a simple, almost effortless hunt turns out to be the product of an extraordinarily long, patient, and remarkably specific evolutionary journey, each piece shaped carefully alongside every other piece, until the finished result became something close to perfectly suited for exactly the environment it now lives within. There is a kind of quiet beauty in that idea, that something as ordinary as a bird settling onto a branch after dark carries within it millions of years of careful, accumulated refinement, almost entirely unnoticed by the world it moves through so silently. It is worth remembering, too, that this same story is quietly repeating itself tonight, and every night, in countless forests scattered across the globe, an ancient rhythm continuing on entirely undisturbed by whether anyone happens to be there to witness it. Picture, one final time, the forest at night, fully dark now beneath a wide, star-scattered sky. Somewhere nearby, an owl lifts silently from its perch, wings catching the cold night air without a single sound escaping into the stillness around it. Below, something small continues moving carefully through the leaves, entirely unaware that the quiet, empty-seeming darkness above has just shifted, decisively, in its direction. This scene, or some close variation of it, is playing out right now, in countless forests, fields, and quiet suburban yards scattered across the world, an ancient, precisely tuned drama unfolding largely without witnesses, exactly as it has for millions of years before any of us were here to notice. There is something deeply calming in knowing this continues on regardless, night after night, whether or not anyone happens to be watching, a steady, patient rhythm woven quietly into the natural world, continuing long after we ourselves have drifted off to sleep. The stars above stay just as scattered, the cold air just as still, the whole scene settling gently into that same unhurried rhythm this entire story has followed from its very first quiet image all the way through to now. We have traveled a long way together across this story, from that very first silent drop through darkness, through the intricate mechanics of light-gathering eyes and precisely tuned hearing, through silent feathers and flexible necks, across snowy tundra and dense rainforest, through centuries of folklore, and finally, back across 60 million years of patient evolutionary history that shaped all of it into what we now understand. What remains, at the very end, is something quietly simple. A creature perfectly suited to a world most of us barely glimpse, moving through darkness not with fear or hesitation, but with the calm, practiced confidence of something built, over an almost unimaginable stretch of time, to belong there completely. The forest stays still now, the owls settled somewhere unseen among the branches, the night continuing on exactly as it always has, exactly as it always will, long after this particular story comes to its own quiet close. There is a certain peace in leaving things here, with the forest calm and the owl resting, the whole quiet system we have spent this story exploring simply continuing on, patiently, exactly as it has for tens of millions of years already, and will likely continue doing for a great many more. Thank you for spending this calm, quiet time exploring the hidden nighttime world of owls with us. If this journey through darkness helped you slow down, relax, and maybe even drift off along the way, consider liking the video, subscribing for more gentle, curious stories like this one, and sharing your own thoughts down in the comments below. Sleep peacefully, and good night.